In the fall of 1987, a map maker was surveying the grounds of a Boy Scout ranch in eastern Missouri. Suddenly, something strange caught his eye. At first, it looked like a turtle shell, but it was a skull. A mystery now unfolded. To solve it, detectives would have to put a face on the grisly discovery. The S-Bar-F Boy Scout Ranch covers 5,400 acres of picturesque countryside in rural Missouri. The mapmaker had discovered the human skull in a remote area of the ranch. Tina Orling was his supervisor.
He was a professional mapmaker from Finland, and he saw the skull within the first few days here. He did not say anything to me or to anyone else about it because he was afraid.
But 3 months later, just before he returned to Finland, the mapmaker finally told Tina about the skull. Using a detailed map of the ranch and following the mapmaker's directions, Tina and the scout ranger searched for the skull. They found what they were looking for in a sparsely wooded clearing.
The sun was glinting off this white object. You could tell right away it was a skull. And I thought to myself, oh boy, we finally found it.
Along with the skull, searchers found a few strands of hair, a lower jaw, and about 40 bones, including a pelvic bone, a femur, and some ribs.
My initial thought was that it may possibly be an Indian grave until we saw the blue jean material.
Searchers unearthed the tattered remains of a pair of jeans, pieces of a flowered shirt, remnants of a plastic shopping bag, and a metal button. To begin the task of identifying the victim, the physical evidence was sent to the Forensic Crime Lab in Jefferson City, Missouri. They began their evaluation with the tattered blue jeans. The outside seam was intact. This helped criminalist Tom Grant determine the overall height of the victim. From cuff to waistband, the outside seam measured 37 inches.
Based on that outside measurement, the inside seam length would probably have been approximately 27 to 28 inches, which is from a short person who would have worn that pair of jeans.
Grant estimated the victim's height to be about 5 feet, and scientists discovered evidence of foul play in the dirt itself when they analyzed a white substance which they found mixed in with the soil at the grave.
The trace section of our laboratory analyzed those and determined the presence of calcium carbonate, which could have been a byproduct of calcium oxide, which is lime.
People put lime there to either stop the odor of the decomposing body or to actually cause it to decompose faster.
Scientists analyzed the hair found at the grave site. Hair can be identified as either Caucasoid, Negroid, or Mongoloid. But the hair was badly damaged. The only conclusion scientists could reach was that it was not Negroid.
The hair on the left is the hair from the grave site. The hair that's on the right is a Negroid or African American head hair, and its characteristics differ considerably from that at the grave site. So I would determine that the hair at the grave site is not of African American origin.
The preliminary information indicated that the victim was a female Caucasian. She was short, about 5 feet tall. Police sent this information to the National Crime Center, a database of all missing persons in the United States and Canada.
And that was unsuccessful. We believed it to be murder. The problem was identifying who the victim was.
Really, the first thought on my mind was this is probably going to be one that we won't be able to solve.
But were investigators even on the right track? One tiny piece of evidence unearthed from the shallow grave would change the course of the investigation and take medical detectives halfway around the world. Investigators believe that the skeletal remains found in the shallow grave had been there for less than 8 years and were those of a petite Caucasian female. One piece of evidence had puzzled investigators from the start: the small metal button found with the remains.
Half of it was somewhat rusted and deteriorated, but the upper half had a logo that was stamped on it. The letters TEXWOOD was present, Tex Wood, and in the O's there was a star-type pattern that was present. None of us at our laboratory had ever seen or heard of that logo before.
But not even the FBI had heard of a product or company by the name of Texwood.
So we began calling all over the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Couldn't find it. So I called a friend of mine with U.S. Customs.
U.S. Customs Special Agent Timothy Quinn entered the name Texwood in his computer. What he discovered gave investigators the first crucial break they needed to identify the victim.
Checks of our computerized importer files were negative. Then had to make a series of phone calls, the last of which was to our national import specialists in New York. And from the Office of the National Import Specialist, we were able to determine that the name Texwood is a make of jeans that was manufactured strictly for consumption in Asia. The brand was not intended to be exported to the United States.
This meant that either the victim had traveled to Asia before her death and purchased the jeans there, or was in fact Asian. To find out more, the bones were sent first to anthropologists at the University of Missouri and later to Colorado State University.
If you have the right bones, you can find out everything you need. You don't need a complete skeleton. The more you have, the more complete picture you can have.
For instance, a skull can tell an anthropologist about gender and race. The first step was to determine whether the skull was Caucasoid, Negroid, or Mongoloid, which includes Native Americans and Asians. A Mongoloid skull usually has broad, squared cheekbones. The anthropologist confirmed police suspicions that the skull was Mongoloid.
The bridge of the nose, the squared cheekbones, the overall smaller features led me to believe that this was a Mongoloid.
The anthropologist confirmed that the victim was indeed female. Since the cranial sutures were closed, and judging from the wear of her teeth, the anthropologist estimated that she was young, most likely in her mid-20s. The bones had smooth surfaces, an indication that the victim was not particularly muscular. Anthropologists estimated her weight to be approximately 120 pounds. And they learned something else from examining her pelvic bone. When a woman has delivered at least 2 children, the separating process of the pelvic bones creates a groove like this one. Such a groove was found on the pelvic bone at the gravesite. Investigators now knew that the victim had given birth to at least 2 children. Still, they were at a dead end.
It's very frustrating because you cannot start the investigation of who committed the crime until you determine who the victim is. And you continually, it's like spinning your wheels, not going anywhere until you can identify the victim.
With little else to go on, the next step was to give the unidentified skull a face. The skeletal remains told authorities what they were looking for: an Asian female who had given birth to at least 2 children. They knew she was petite, standing about 5 feet tall and weighing about 120 pounds. But what did she look like? Police asked the anthropologist to bring the skull to life through the technique of facial reconstruction. First, the reconstructionist makes a latex mold of the actual skull. Once the mold is made, the skull can be returned to police to be used as evidence. Then a plaster cast is made from the latex mold. Using this plaster cast, rubber pegs called landmarks are glued onto the cast. They represent tissue thicknesses at various points on the face. Facial tissue thicknesses differ from men and women and vary with race and age. Next, the landmarks are connected with strips of clay following the contours of the skull.
Each individual skull is like a blueprint or a fingerprint. No two are alike. We follow this blueprint then to create our faces, following the shape, the bends of each skull.
The spaces between the clay strips are then filled in to flesh out the face. Plastic brown eyes are carefully aligned and set in the sockets, and lids are molded. Final touches include a nose and lips. And because the victim was presumed to be Asian, the bust was given a black wig. The identity of the victim was still unknown, but police now had an important tool in their investigation, a face they hoped would jar someone's memory. They sent photographs of the bust to newspapers and television stations in the nearby cities, hoping for a response. The wait lasted just 3 days.
Skeletal remains of a woman were found in St.
Wheelie
Francis
Porn
County.
Cox was
Identifying
watching
those
television
remains and
when she
Newhouse
saw
focused
the
the
bust on a
investigation
local
on her
news
husband.
program.
Then I call my husband, tell my husband what I saw in the TV.
Her husband Carmen picked up a newspaper, looked at the bust, and thought he recognized it as well.
Called her back. I said, boy, it's awful close. I think we ought to do something.
The Coxes said the bust looked like their friend who lived in a nearby town, 33-year-old Bunchy Nyhouse, whom they hadn't seen for the past 5 years. They told police that Bunchy had left her husband Richard and had returned home to her native Thailand. When police questioned Richard Nyhouse, he did not believe that the skull found at the Boy Scout ranch 100 miles away from his home was that of his wife Bunchy. Richard said Bunchy had told him that she missed her family in Thailand and that she wanted to divorce him. He said he personally drove her to the St. Louis airport 5 years earlier to take her flight to Thailand. He said that was the last time he and his children saw her, and they never heard from her again. And neighbors confirmed that Bunchy had in fact spoken of returning to Thailand.
I knew she told me she had gotten her passport. She had gotten her citizenship and her passport. So it wouldn't have surprised me, if she had done that.
She mentioned to me, she's not happy. She like to go Thailand, visit family.
And if Bunchy was indeed the woman found in the shallow grave, why hadn't her family in Thailand reported her missing during the last 5 years? For the information police needed, scientists once again looked for answers in the bones. Had Bunchy Nyhouse left behind her 2 children and returned to Thailand as her husband claimed? Or were her remains those found in the shallow grave at the Boy Scout ranch? The answer lay in the skull and a technique called skull photograph superimposition. Police obtained this photograph of Bunchy from her husband Richard and sent it to the anthropology department at Colorado State University. Police also included a photograph of another Asian woman who was reported missing in Georgia. The photographic work was done by the late Dr. Michael Charney, a world-renowned forensic anthropologist at Colorado State University. Charney positioned the skull in the same pose as the photographs of both women, then superimposed slides of the skull over the photographs. The skull did not match the woman from Georgia, but it did match the photo of Bunchy Nyhouse perfectly.
Face is at an angle. She's clowning around making a face. We find that the jawline is within the chin, the top is within the top of the head, the cheek is within, the eyes are in the orbits, the nasal opening corresponds to the nose, and the teeth match up very nicely to the jawline here. In spite of the fact that it's a very difficult angle to approximate, an expression to approximate, we felt this was a very good match.
Now armed with a positive scientific identification, police turned their attention to Richard Nyhouse. They suspected that he knew more about his wife's disappearance than he was telling them.
Her friends indicated that they had a very volatile relationship, that they argued quite a bit.
And police also learned of a disturbing coincidence that Richard Nyhouse was a Boy Scout leader and often camped at the Boy Scout ranch where police discovered Bunchy's grave.
And I turned to my partner and we looked at each other and we just couldn't believe it. That's when we knew we had to formulate a game plan, and we'd have probably just one shot at him.
It all started fitting together at that point. All the pieces started coming into place.
When police confronted Richard Nyhouse with the forensic evidence, he confessed, although he gave conflicting accounts of what actually happened. He said Bunchy fell during a scuffle and hit her head accidentally, but admitted suffocating his wife.
Was bleeding real bad. There was blood all over the place, and she was yelling, screaming. So I put my hands over her mouth and her nose, suffocated her.
In light of the confession, forensic pathologist Dr. Mary Case examined the skull. She studied the small wound on the back of the skull and concluded that it was not the result of an accident, but rather the result of blunt trauma to the head.
This is a very limited area. It's pushed inward, and we tend to see this kind of a depressed skull fracture when you strike the head with something that has very forceful impact over a very small striking surface. A hammer would be a good example of something that could do that. It's a tool. It's meant to strike, and all of the force is directed onto a very small striking surface.
Based on the forensic evidence and parts of Nyhouse's confession, prosecutors believe that Richard and Bunchy argued one night in the basement of their home.
We're not moving. We've been through this before. We are not moving, all right?
Bunchy wanted to move into a new house. Richard refused, saying they couldn't afford it.
And I'm taking the boys and leaving.
The blow to her head was not fatal, but while she lay bleeding on the floor, Richard suffocated her. He used a service merchandise bag to contain the bleeding, wrapped the body in a sheet of plastic, and placed her in the freezer, where she remained for the next 3 months. Nyhouse fabricated the story about driving Bunchy to the St. Louis airport for a flight to Thailand. When spring arrived and the ground thawed, Richard took Bunchy's body to the Boy Scout ranch, a 2-hour drive from his home. He chose a secluded area deep in the woods for the burial, but made a number of mistakes. The lime he spread over the body most likely aided decomposition, but the grave was only 2 feet deep, not deep enough to keep burrowing animals from bringing her bones to the surface. And Bunchy was buried in Texwood jeans, which told a story, since they were made and sold exclusively in Asia. Nyhouse never anticipated that his wife's remains would be discovered, and if they were, that they would ever be successfully identified. Finding the Texwood button, the pelvic bone that revealed the victim had at least 2 children, the mongoloid skull, the forensic sculpture, and the photographic superimposition all were essential elements in the identification. During the trial, Dr. Case testified that it takes between 3 and 5 minutes to suffocate an individual. After a minute or 2, the person would only be unconscious. It was entirely possible that Nyhouse put his wife into the freezer while she was still alive. Richard Nyhouse was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 50 years.
It was great forensic science, and of course, that's how it's supposed to work. You get a button, you get a hair, and the expert in that area can tell you. And if you look at the button work, it took about a month. It was less than a month for someone to look at that button and say, well, that's only manufactured in that part of the world. Well, somebody had to collect all that information, and I admire that. I think that's wonderful.
It took all the different scientific and forensic people to make this thing happen, any one piece of which could have stopped the investigation.
One of the unique things about the case was actually having the remains to do the trial, and Bungie Nyhouse actually came alive in her own trial. This was one of the few cases where a prosecutor got to try a murder case with the victim actually in the courtroom with him, speaking to the jury.
In December of 1989, federal court judge Robert Vance and his wife were preparing for the busy Christmas holiday.
Who sent the box?
I don't know. Doesn't say.
It was a delivery he never expected. Robert and Helen Vance lived with their family in an affluent suburb of Birmingham, Alabama. For more than a decade, Robert Vance had been a federal court judge for the 11th District, presiding over cases from Alabama, Georgia, and Florida.
He was very bright. Not only the book smart, kind of bright, but he had just amazing common sense, street smarts.
Judge Vance undoubtedly had his share of enemies, but had never received any threats, which explains why he wasn't suspicious of the package mailed to him a few days before Christmas. The package contained a pipe bomb with nails wrapped around the pipe, which acted like shrapnel. The blast killed Judge Vance instantly. His body was thrown clear across the kitchen. Miraculously, Helen Vance survived the explosion, and she was able to get to a neighbor's home for help.
Mom suffered some severe injuries from the explosion. She had several cuts in the flesh from the nails that the bomb had been bound with. And she had had several internal injuries from nails actually penetrating the body, including one that had done some damage to her liver.
U.S. Marshals warned all members of the judiciary to be on the alert for any suspicious mail packages. 2 days later, a security guard at the 11th Circuit Court in Atlanta noticed something unusual in a routine X-ray of packages entering the building. Inside the package was an 8-inch tube attached to a pair of flashlight batteries, the telltale sign of a pipe bomb. Investigators did not want to detonate the bomb. They wanted it dismantled in order to study its construction. When they did, experts determined that this bomb was identical to the one that killed Judge Robert Vance.
The bombs told us that we were dealing with a very angry guy because of the nature of their construction, and the nature of that construction also told us that we were dealing with a very purposeful individual, someone who had not just idly gotten mad and done this, but someone who really did a good deal of work in putting this together.
The bomb had two unique characteristics which investigators had never seen before. The bomb and the inside of the box had been covered with black enamel paint. It had square end caps which were bolted and welded onto the ends, which delayed the explosion and increased its force. Unfortunately, scientists could find no trace evidence inside the bomb package, no hair, fibers, or fingerprints. The bomb was similar to a tear gas bomb which exploded 4 months earlier in the Atlanta office of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. Along with that bomb was a letter, a declaration of war against the 11th Circuit Court.
The attacks will continue until widespread terror forces the court to adopt the impartial and equitable treatment of all as its highest priority.
No one knew why a threat against the 11th Circuit Court had been sent to the NAACP, which was involved in civil rights issues. Investigators suspected that the tear gas bomb was mailed as a test to see if it could be sent through the mail without exploding. When that test was successful, the bomber started on his path of murder. 2 days after the bomb explosion which killed Judge Robert Vance, Robert Robinson, a civil rights attorney, went to work as usual at his office in Savannah, Georgia. Waiting for him on his desk was a package that had been sent to him through the mail. When he opened it, it exploded. His friend, Dr. Brown, was across the street and rushed to his aid.
I'm just holding him at this point, looking around the room, surveying, of course, the damage and then seeing the wounds that he had suffered. Throughout that process, you see, having my arm under his armpit, could feel actually his pulse as it waned.
3 hours later, Robert Robinson died. The bomb was set to detonate when the string wrapped around the outside of the package was pulled. Genetic material such as hair or saliva on the mailing labels or on the backs of the stamps.
These were very meticulously built bombs. So meticulous that some of the finest forensic machinery in the world failed to find one speck of DNA, one fingerprint, so much as a trace of powder under a fingernail.
On the same day that Robert Robinson was murdered, Willie Dennis received an identical package in the mail. At the time, Willie Dennis was president of the NAACP office in Jacksonville, Florida. But Miss Dennis was late for a meeting, so she left her office before opening the package. That night at home, she received a phone call from a friend.
This is Lita. I don't know whether you've heard the news, but Bobby Robinson in Savannah, Georgia has received a bomb. And he was killed instantly. He said, now if you receive any funny looking packages, you make sure that you notify the sheriff's office.
Which is
who opened our smoke bomb? The officers of the NAACP have become targets for assassination.
The letters and mailing labels had all been typed with the same typewriter, which had a signature flaw. The number 1 on the keypad did not match the typeface of the other keys. It was a replacement.
There was a broken key which was replaced with a different type key. So that was fairly unique. I mean, the odds of finding another one with that same letter replaced with another typewriter was a fairly unique characteristic.
The FBI searched the files of the 11th Circuit Court looking for any documents which might have been typed with the same typewriter. More than 1 million documents were examined. The FBI found one letter typed with the same typewriter. It had the same flaw. The number 1 was a different typeface. The letter dealt with an obscure life insurance case from 1987. And the sender was alive and well in the small town of Enterprise, Alabama. The investigation into these bombings became the largest and most exhaustive in the history of federal law enforcement. Investigators used every method at their disposal to find the typewriter used to type the letters and mailing labels on the bomb packages. Their investigation revealed that the same typewriter had been used by a man in Enterprise, Alabama, Robert Wayne O'Farrell, to type a letter about an insurance dispute.
My sense of the typewriter match that led them to Enterprise was that this was believed by agents to be almost tantamount to a fingerprint. I mean, a solid forensic link.
O'Farrell was a junk dealer, and investigators searched every inch of his home, garage, and warehouse. They even excavated his septic system, but they couldn't find the typewriter. O'Farrell recalled typing the insurance letter, but couldn't remember what happened to the typewriter. His daughter had a vague recollection of selling it to a young woman about a year earlier, but could provide no description of the buyer, and she had no receipt of sale. With the typewriter now a dead end, investigators were left with the bombs as their main source of evidence. Pictures of the bombs were distributed to bomb experts throughout the country. No one had ever seen a bomb constructed quite like this before.
Got a call from a very good friend of mine, Lloyd Irwin, who is a chemist analyst of ATFs up in Atlanta. And Lloyd called and asked, what did I have? And I said something to the effect, the damnedest pipe bomb I've ever seen. It's got a threaded rod that ran right through the middle of it. And I went on to say something to the effect that I'd never seen or heard of such a design feature in a pipe bomb before. And his response was, well, I have. I said, oh, tell me about it.
Lloyd Irwin recalled a similar bomb many years earlier, one with a rod through the center and the same distinctive square end caps.
It's the only one that we'd ever had like that. We have lots of pipe bombs and different kinds, and even remote controls. But when you have one, it's the only one you've ever seen like it. I mean, and it sticks.
Irwin searched through the thousands of cases in his file all the way back to 1972 and learned that the bomb he recalled had accidentally maimed a woman who came across it unexpectedly in her home. Authorities suspected that the bomb had been constructed by her husband, Walter Leroy Moody. Although he denied it, Moody was convicted of constructive possession of that bomb and sentenced to 6 years in the state penitentiary. Walter Leroy Moody was furious about that conviction, and after he was released from prison, spent the next 10 years trying to have his conviction overturned. Mark Winnie described Moody's legal battles in his book, Priority Mail.
I think those who have come to know Moody in various spheres would say that Moody could be charming. He could be, in some respects, enormously bright. I think one psychologist called him a genius. But on the other hand, he could become blinded by obsession.
That obsession may have included the case of Julie Love, a young white woman who was murdered and raped by a group of black defendants in one of the most highly publicized cases in Atlanta history, a case tried at the 11th Circuit Court. This was the case mentioned in one of the bomber's letters.
Anytime a black man rapes a white woman in Alabama, Florida, or Georgia in the future, Americans for a competent federal judicial system shall assassinate one federal judge, one attorney, and one officer of the NAACP.
It's not happen chance that he's mad with the 11th Court of Appeals where he sent a bomb. And the 11th Court of Appeals is made up of the states of Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. So all three of those states got a bomb.
But if Walter Leroy Moody was the bomber, authorities couldn't prove it. They had no forensic evidence linking him to any of the bombings. After interviewing more than 6,000 people, poring over 1 million documents, and examining the case files of every bombing in the United States, federal authorities were convinced that Walter Leroy Moody was the serial bomber. Federal agents searched the home Moody shared with his second wife, Susan. The search was so complete that even the floorboards were removed and the entire residence vacuumed for gunpowder and other trace evidence. But authorities could not find one single piece of evidence in their search.
I'm not concerned about anybody finding any connections
regarding those or any other bombings ever.
Although investigators found nothing inside Moody's home, it was what they didn't find that was revealing.
The first search of the house appeared as the house had been sterilized, meaning that normal things that would be found in a house that could be used to fabricate a bomb device, wire, nails, pliers, even pieces of pipe, things that you probably have around your house, they were totally lacking, absent.
Investigators believe that Moody used the cap, gloves, and safety glasses to dress himself like a surgeon while making the bombs, so that he wouldn't leave genetic material in the package. Moody sprayed the inside of the package with black enamel paint to mask any fingerprints, hairs, or fibers that may have been left inadvertently. Prosecutors believe that Moody removed all of the materials he used to make the bombs before his home was searched. Susan Moody also confirmed that she had purchased a used typewriter for her husband, which had later been thrown away. There was one more piece of evidence that investigators had almost given up on, the fingerprint found on one of the bomber's letters. Susan Moody told the FBI that she had copied the letters for her husband in a small shop in Florence, Kentucky.
Excuse me? I think the copier is out of paper.
When the copy machine ran out of paper, one of the employees put more in. When he did, his fingers touched the top piece of paper. Moody's story. It was the link investigators needed to tie Moody to the bombs.
And that's where they bought the boxes that contained the bombs, and it's where they did some Xeroxing. And to prove that they did the Xeroxing, the fingerprint was there. The fingerprint did not change. The pattern on the Xerox machine changes over a period of time, so forensically, that fingerprint, to the exclusion of everything else in the whole world, put them at the place that she said they were, where they bought the boxes.
If you look at Susan Moody's testimony by itself, there could have been the potential for the defense to say, this is the ex-wife who has a motive to want to stay out of jail. But the key is that much of what Susan Moody testified to could be corroborated by forensic science.
Susan Moody was granted immunity and testified for the prosecution. Walter Leroy Moody was found guilty of the murders of Judge Robert Vance and Robert Robinson and was sentenced to death by electrocution.
I think if we had not identified Moody as a potential suspect very quickly, I think there would have been more bombs. I don't think he was through. I really don't think he was through. I don't think he would have ever been through, as long as he was out there.
The evidence suggests that the bomber's obsession with making his devices just that much deadlier, that much more vicious and destructive, is ultimately what became Roy Moody's undoing. Some people would call that irony. I think some people would call it justice.
The night it happened did not announce itself with sirens or screams. It arrived quietly, wrapped in ordinary sounds, the hum of a highway miles away, the dull flicker of a porch light fighting moths in the dark, the kind of night Missouri had seen 1,000 times before and would see 1,000 times again, except this one refused to stay buried. Years later, investigators would say the case began before anyone knew a crime had been committed, before anyone knew a life had already slipped into history, before the town understood that what was missing would matter more than what was found. The house sat just off a county road, paint faded, mailbox leaning, grass trimmed enough to look cared for but not enough to suggest urgency. Inside, there were signs of routine interrupted. A coffee cup half full, cold by morning. A radio still tuned to a local station, the DJ's voice fading into static sometime after midnight. No blood. No forced entry. No shattered glass to spark panic. Just absence, subtle and unsettling, the kind that doesn't scream danger until it has time to echo. When the missing person report was filed, it carried none of the weight it would later earn. Adults go missing, the paperwork said. People leave. People choose silence. Missouri had seen that too. Officers asked the standard questions, checked the usual places, took notes they would later read and reread, wondering how much truth had slipped past them disguised as normality. At the time, there was no headline, no breaking news banner, just a name added to a list that would quietly grow longer. The town reacted the way small towns often do, with cautious curiosity, with rumors whispered at gas pumps and folded into church conversations. Some said there had been trouble at home. Others said money. Others said nothing at all, choosing the comfort of not knowing. Familiar routines continued, school buses running their routes, diners opening before sunrise, the case hovering just outside daily life like a shadow no one wanted to turn toward. Days passed, then weeks.
Then the tone changed.
The missing person became a cold case without ever becoming a hot one. Files were stacked. Leads thinned. Tips came in, vague and contradictory, each one promising just enough to justify another interview, another drive down a gravel road that led nowhere. The case learned how to wait. Investigators followed what they had. A last known sighting that shifted depending on who remembered it. A phone call that might have meant something, or might have meant nothing at all. A vehicle seen parked where it shouldn't have been, unless it had every right to be there. Each detail felt important until it didn't. Each theory collapsed under its own weight. There was no body to speak for the truth, no clear moment where everything broke. Just a long, slow fade into uncertainty. Years went by, and the town adapted. New families moved in, old ones moved out. The missing person's name became something people recognized but no longer discussed, like an abandoned building everyone learned to ignore. The case file gathered dust, literal and metaphorical, pages yellowing, ink fading, but still intact, waiting for someone to open it again with fresh eyes and enough stubbornness to believe the past had unfinished business. Inside the department, the case was mentioned occasionally, usually late at night, usually by someone flipping through old records with nothing else demanding their attention. It became a benchmark for frustration, a reminder that not every story ends neatly, that some questions resist even the most determined answers. Younger officers learned it as a cautionary tale. Older ones remembered it as a failure they carried quietly. And then, without warning, the silence cracked. It didn't come from a confession. It didn't come from a piece of evidence rediscovered in a forgotten box. It came from a voice no one expected, a witness who had lived alongside the truth for years without realizing it had value. Someone ordinary. Someone overlooked. Someone who had never imagined their memory would matter. The tip arrived like so many others, modest in tone, cautious in language. A phone call that didn't demand attention, that didn't claim certainty, that simply said, "There's something I remember now, and I don't know if it matters." In another time, it might have been dismissed, filed away, thanked politely, and forgotten. But something about it lingered, a detail too specific to ignore, a hesitation that felt genuine rather than rehearsed. Investigators reopened the file, not with confidence, but with habit. They read through reports written by people long retired, some no longer alive. They traced timelines that had once seemed solid and now looked fragile. They compared the new statement to old ones, searching for overlap, for friction, for anything that sparked. Slowly, reluctantly, the pieces began to shift. The witness described a night that had blended into every other night until time gave it shape. A sound heard through an open window. A vehicle idling longer than necessary. A figure standing where no one should have been standing, doing nothing that looked like a crime, and yet everything about it now felt wrong. At the time, it had been dismissed by the mind as coincidence. Years later, it returned with weight. Investigators mapped the statement against the original timeline, adjusting minutes, reconsidering assumptions. Suddenly, gaps appeared where certainty had once lived. Routes once considered impossible now made sense. Alibis grew thin. People who had never been suspects before found themselves quietly reconsidered. The town didn't know any of this yet. Life continued as usual, unaware that something old had begun to move. The cold case, dormant for years, was awake again, stretching, testing its reach. Inside interview rooms and unmarked offices, conversations grew sharper, more focused. The language changed. Instead of if, they began to say when. Instead of theory, they said sequence. The witness returned for a second interview, then a third. Each time, the memory sharpened not because it was changing, but because it was finally being examined. Investigators asked questions no one had asked before, not because they hadn't thought of them, but because they hadn't believed the answers would exist. Now they did. What followed was not a sudden revelation, but a slow, methodical reconstruction. The kind that takes patience. The kind that demands trust in small details. A timeline rebuilt minute by minute. A route traced again and again. A behavior pattern re-examined without the bias of earlier conclusions. The case began to breathe. Somewhere in the process, investigators realized they were no longer asking what happened. They were asking who knew it would happen and who had counted on no one remembering. The unexpected witness had opened a door that refused to close again, and behind it waited questions that had been patient for decades. The Missouri cold case, once defined by absence, was now defined by presence. A memory, a voice, a moment that refused to stay forgotten. And as the investigation gathered momentum, one truth became impossible to ignore. The past had not been silent all these years. It had simply been waiting for the right person to speak, and for someone willing to listen. The file reopened with a sound that felt louder than it was, cardboard against metal, a drawer sliding out after years of resisting movement, the scrape echoing in a room where time had been measured in unfinished sentences. Inside, the case looked smaller than memory had made it. Thin. Incomplete. A life reduced to reports, timelines, grainy photographs that captured places, but never truth. Yet the moment investigators leaned in, the weight returned, heavy and immediate, as if the past had been holding its breath. They started where everyone always starts, at the beginning, except now the beginning looked different. The last confirmed day was no longer just a date circled in ink. It was a sequence, fragile and precise. Morning routines.
Привычный errands.
A stop that hadn't mattered before suddenly mattered a great deal. The witness's memory slipped neatly into a gap no one had noticed was there, a sliver of time unaccounted for, a silence that now had shape. The original investigators had moved fast, too fast in hindsight, driven by pressure, by limited resources, by the unspoken belief that answers reveal themselves early, or not at all. They had chased loud leads. They had trusted familiar faces. They had accepted explanations that fit, because fitting felt like closure. Now, decades later, the new team did the opposite. They slowed everything down. They listened to what had been dismissed. They treated every assumption like a suspect. The witness's account was replayed again and again, not just the words but the pauses, the hesitations, the moments where certainty faltered and then returned stronger. This wasn't someone chasing attention. This was someone haunted by an image that had refused to fade, a detail that had sharpened with age instead of dulling. Investigators recognized the tone immediately. Regret mixed with fear. Relief tangled with dread. They walked the area together, the witness and the detectives, standing under the same sky, decades older. The landscape altered just enough to disorient, but not enough to erase memory. The witness pointed.
There.
That's where the car was. That's how long it stayed. That's why it felt wrong. The gesture was small, almost apologetic, but it landed like a confession the witness hadn't known they were carrying. Back at the station, maps covered the walls. Old aerial photos overlapped with new ones. Routes were traced in marker, erased, redrawn. Times were recalculated. What once seemed impossible now looked obvious. What once looked obvious now collapsed entirely. A narrative began to emerge, not dramatic, not cinematic, but chilling in its simplicity.
Opportunity.
Familiarity. Silence. Names resurfaced, not as accusations, but as questions. People who had been interviewed once and never again. Statements taken at face value when contradiction should have been probed. Alibis built on routine rather than proof. The past revealed its blind spots one by one, and with each revelation came a quiet anger, not at individuals, but at the system that had allowed the case to cool before it ever burned hot. One name in particular began to echo louder than the others. Not because it was new, but because it had always been there, tucked neatly into the margins, never bolded, never circled. A person close enough to know patterns. Close enough to predict movements. Close enough to disappear into the background without raising alarms. Back then, familiarity had been comfort. Now it looked like cover. Investigators revisited the original interview transcript. Read it line by line. Compared it to the new timeline. The words hadn't changed, but their meaning had. Innocent phrases now sounded rehearsed. Casual remarks felt calculated. Small inconsistencies, once dismissed as nerves, now formed a rhythm. Not proof.
Not yet.
But enough to justify another look. When they knocked on the door decades later, it opened without surprise. The face on the other side had aged, lines etched by time and weather, eyes that measured before they spoke. The conversation was polite, controlled. The past was discussed as if it belonged to someone else. The missing person's name was spoken carefully, like a fragile object. Investigators listened. They always listen. They let silence do the work. The answers came smoothly, too smoothly. The same story, unchanged by time, unchanged by reflection. That consistency raised more questions than it answered. Memory doesn't work like that. Truth shifts, details blur, emotions alter perspective. A story that remains perfectly intact for decades is not preserved. It's maintained. After the interview, the room felt heavier. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it. The case had direction now, a current pulling them forward. They returned to the witness, asked deeper questions, pressed gently but persistently. Each answer tightened the frame. Each clarification narrowed the field. The community remained unaware, but tension hummed beneath the surface. Investigators moved quietly, aware that attention could spook a fragile truth back into hiding. Records were requested. Old phone logs examined. Employment histories revisited. Movements reconstructed. The past resisted at every turn, records lost, memories faded, evidence degraded. But enough remained. Just enough. Then came the break that no one expected. Not from technology, not from a lab, but from a human moment. A casual conversation sparked by renewed interest in the case. Someone remembered something they had never connected to anything before. A remark made in passing. A reaction that seemed strange only in retrospect. The kind of detail that lives comfortably in the mind until someone gives it context. The investigators felt the shift immediately. That familiar tightening in the chest. That sense that the ground had moved. They followed it carefully, aware that momentum can be dangerous if not controlled. Each step was verified. Each conclusion resisted until it could stand on its own. As the pieces aligned, a picture formed that was both horrifying and mundane. No grand conspiracy. No elaborate cover-up. Just a moment where someone believed they could act without consequence, where the absence of noise would be mistaken for absence of crime. For years, that belief had been right. Until it wasn't. The unexpected witness had done more than recall a memory. They had disrupted a narrative that had grown comfortable with itself. They had introduced uncertainty where certainty had been assumed. And in that uncertainty, the truth found space to breathe. The case was no longer cold. It was restless.
Alive.
And somewhere in Missouri, someone who had believed themselves safe within the distance of time began to realize that the past does not forget. It waits. The moment a case begins to move again, it does not announce itself with sirens or headlines. It announces itself with pressure. Quiet, relentless pressure, building behind closed doors, in unlit hallways, in the minds of people who suddenly realize that something they buried long ago has started to surface. In Missouri, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Phones rang longer. Emails were reread before being sent. Old acquaintances felt a new distance in familiar conversations. The past was no longer dormant. It was awake. Investigators returned to the timeline, not to rewrite it, but to interrogate it. Every minute was treated like a witness capable of lying. The witness's memory, once a single data point, was now a spine around which everything else began to align. The car, the location, the time window. It narrowed possibility until coincidence became implausible. What had once been a broad mystery was compressing into something far more dangerous. Specificity. They focused on movement. Who was where? Who could have seen what? Who had reason to be nearby without raising suspicion? Patterns emerged that had been invisible before. A routine that looked harmless in isolation now appeared strategic when viewed through the lens of opportunity. The investigators didn't rush to name it intent. They didn't need to. The pattern spoke loudly enough on its own. They pulled old witness statements, not looking for contradictions, but for tone. Fear leaves fingerprints. Guilt leaves rhythms. In one transcript, a line stood out, overlooked for decades because it sounded too normal. A sentence meant to reassure, to minimize concern. Back then, it had closed a door. Now it opened one. The team tracked down the person who had spoken those words. Years had changed their appearance, but not their habits. The same posture, the same measured pauses. When asked about the case again, their reaction was almost imperceptible. A blink held too long. A breath taken at the wrong moment. Tiny fractures in a carefully maintained calm. Investigators didn't confront. They observed. Pressure works best when it's invisible. Meanwhile, the unexpected witness struggled with the weight of what they had triggered. Sleep came in fragments. Memories resurfaced uninvited. They wondered how different everything might have been if they had spoken sooner. Investigators reassured them, but reassurance can't rewrite time. All it can do is acknowledge courage where silence once lived. As the case gained shape, law enforcement faced an uncomfortable truth. This wasn't just about what had been missed. It was about what had been accepted. Assumptions made because they were convenient. Trust extended because it felt safe. The system had not failed loudly. It had failed quietly, and that made the reckoning harder. They began cross-referencing alibis with fresh eyes. One in particular unraveled quickly, built on habit rather than documentation, supported by memory instead of evidence. Back then, it had been enough. Now it was paper-thin. Investigators documented the discrepancies carefully, aware that momentum without precision can collapse an entire case. Then came the second witness. Not someone new. Someone original. Interviewed once, dismissed quickly, their account deemed unreliable due to uncertainty. Time had sharpened their recollection. What they once thought might have been nothing now felt heavy. They remembered a sound, a tone, a look exchanged between two people that didn't fit the moment. At the time, it had passed. Now, it returned with clarity that startled them. The investigators listened. They didn't interrupt. They let the memory unfold at its own pace. When it ended, the room was quiet. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone understood the implication. Two independent recollections, decades apart, now pointed in the same direction. Still, no arrests. No public movement. The case demanded restraint. Prosecutors were consulted early, their skepticism welcomed rather than resisted. Every theory was challenged. Every leap of logic forced back to solid ground. The goal was no longer progress. It was permanence. Behind the scenes, the person at the center of this tightening narrative felt the walls closing in. They noticed unfamiliar cars. Familiar faces asking unfamiliar questions. Old acquaintances suddenly avoiding eye contact. The safety of obscurity was slipping. Time, once their greatest ally, was becoming their greatest threat. Investigators returned again. Another conversation. Another opportunity for the truth to surface voluntarily. The questions were sharper now. More specific. The response is slower, less confident. When confronted with inconsistencies, the subject deflected, blamed memory, blamed confusion. Investigators nodded. Memory is always convenient when truth is dangerous. After the interview, one detective sat alone with the recordings, listening not to what was said, but how it was said. The shifts in cadence, the moments of over-explanation, the instinct to control the narrative instead of respond to it. These were not proofs, but they were signals. The case file, once thin, now bulged with new material. The past was no longer abstract. It was present, heavy, undeniable. Investigators knew they were close, but closeness is deceptive. Many cases collapse in the final stretch, undone by haste or assumption. This one would not. Outside the station, life continued. People went to work. Kids went to school. The town remained unaware that beneath its routines, a truth long buried was pushing upward, cracking the surface. The unexpected witness had opened a door. What lay beyond it was no longer speculation. It was waiting. When investigators say a case is tightening, what they really mean is that options are disappearing. Escape routes close quietly. Explanations lose elasticity. Stories that once flexed under casual scrutiny begin to snap when pressure is applied evenly, methodically, without emotion. In Missouri, the investigation entered that phase where every new fact didn't expand the mystery, it compressed it. They reconstructed the night again, this time minute by minute, treating time like a crime scene of its own.
Streetlights.
Traffic patterns. Business hours. Weather reports pulled from archive data. A light rain had fallen that evening, brief, but enough to change behavior. People moved faster. Windows closed earlier. Sounds carried differently. What once felt like background detail now mattered. The unexpected witness's account placed a vehicle in a location it had no reason to be. Not parked. Idling. Waiting. That distinction shifted everything. Waiting implies intention. Investigators cross-checked vehicle registrations from the era, filtering through ownership changes, sales records, junkyard transfers. One vehicle stood out. Not because it was rare, but because it vanished from records shortly after the crime.
Sold.
Resold. Disassembled. A quiet erasure. They traced that erasure to a name already in the file. A name that had never been accused, never officially suspected, only noted in the margins. Someone close enough to know routines. Close enough to anticipate movements. Close enough to be trusted.
Trust.
That word hovered over the case like a ghost. The community had trusted this person. So had investigators, unconsciously, years ago. Trust had softened questions. Trust had shortened interviews. Trust had allowed assumptions to settle where scrutiny should have lived. They didn't repeat that mistake. Another interview was scheduled, this time under different circumstances. Not informal, not friendly. Recorded, structured. Every question placed deliberately, designed to test not memory but consistency. The subject arrived calm, almost rehearsed. They had lived with this story for decades. It had become muscle memory. The detective began with neutral ground. Family.
Work.
Life since the 80s. The subject relaxed, posture opening, voice steady. Then the questions edged closer. Names from the past. Locations.
Times.
The voice tightened. Shoulders rose. The story remained the same, but the effort required to maintain it increased. Then came the detail they hadn't prepared for. A minor fact, recently uncovered, never public. The subject hesitated. A fraction of a second. Enough. Their answer contradicted the record. Not dramatically.
Subtly.
But the detective didn't correct them.
He moved on.
Pressure works best when the subject doesn't know exactly where it's coming from. After the interview, analysts compared statements across decades. The shifts were small but patterned. Each retelling smoothed rough edges. Each version reduced proximity, minimized presence. Distance increased with time, not because memory faded, but because distance felt safer. Meanwhile, forensic teams revisited physical evidence long considered exhausted. Items once deemed irrelevant were re-examined with modern techniques. Fibers. Trace materials. Something microscopic had survived 3 decades unnoticed, preserved by accident rather than design. It wasn't definitive on its own, but it spoke the same language as the witnesses. Alignment. That's when cases break. Prosecutors were brought back in. This time, their tone changed. Skepticism softened into focus. They asked sharper questions, demanded stronger connections. Investigators delivered patiently. No leaps. No assumptions. Just accumulation. Brick by brick. The community still knew nothing. No leaks. No rumors. Silence was intentional. An arrest made too early could fracture everything. The goal was not reaction. It was resolution. The unexpected witness was informed that the case was advancing. Their relief was complicated. Vindication tangled with fear. They had told the truth, but truth has consequences. Investigators promised protection, anonymity where possible, but they couldn't promise peace. That had been lost the moment the memory surfaced. As night fell over the town, the suspect sat alone, unaware of how narrow their world had become. They still believed time would protect them. It always had. But time, like memory, is loyal only until it isn't. And somewhere between the past and the present, the case crossed a threshold. It was no longer a question of if the truth would surface, only how violently it would disrupt everything built on its absence. By the time the investigation reached its 5th breath, the case no longer felt dormant, it felt dangerous. Not in the way violence announces itself, but in the way instability spreads when long-standing assumptions collapse. The truth was beginning to destabilize people who had built entire lives on the certainty that the past would stay buried. And buried things, once disturbed, don't rise gently. Investigators turned their attention inward, scrutinizing not just the evidence, but the process that had once dismissed it. Old decisions were re-examined without defensiveness. Reports reread without nostalgia. The goal was not blame. It was clarity. Every missed opportunity carried information, and information, even decades late, still had value. One oversight in particular stood out. A report filed 2 days after the crime. Short. Procedural. Almost dismissive. It documented a sighting that didn't align with the original narrative, and because it didn't align, it had been set aside. Not disproven. Just ignored. Now, placed alongside the unexpected witness and the second corroborating account, it no longer looked incidental. It looked prophetic. The detective assigned to the cold case unit felt the shift viscerally. This was no longer reconstruction. This was convergence. Independent lines of inquiry, developed years apart, now intersected at the same point. That doesn't happen often. And when it does, it rarely happens by accident. They returned to the geography of the crime, walking the area as it existed now, then mentally stripping it back to what it had been. Fewer lights, fewer buildings, more darkness, more opportunity. A narrow corridor where someone could wait unseen and leave without being noticed. The unexpected witness had described it as quiet. Too quiet. That description now made sense. Technology filled in what memory could not. Old maps layered with modern satellite data. Traffic modeling software simulating movement patterns. The route the suspect claimed to have taken that night no longer held up under analysis. It required improbable timing. Perfect conditions. A coincidence too precise to be believable. Investigators didn't celebrate the contradiction. They documented it. Meanwhile, the suspect began to sense a shift they couldn't articulate. Friends became distant. Casual check-ins from law enforcement became formal requests. The tone had changed. Politeness remained, but warmth disappeared. That absence was louder than accusation. At home, the suspect revisited their own memories, rehearsing the story they had told for years. It had always felt solid, unquestionable. But now, small doubts crept in. Not about what had happened, but about whether the story still worked. Whether it could survive scrutiny it had never faced before. Another piece fell into place quietly. Financial records from the era, long buried in microfilm, revealed a transaction that contradicted the suspect's account of their movements. Not criminal, not incriminating on its own, but inconvenient. It placed them closer than they claimed. Close enough to hear. Close enough to see. The prosecutors were informed. This time, they didn't ask whether the case was viable. They asked how soon it could be ready. Investigators resisted urgency. They had learned the cost of speed. Every new discovery was stress-tested. Could it stand alone? Could it be explained away? Could it survive a hostile courtroom? Only evidence that answered yes to all three questions stayed. The unexpected witness was interviewed again, this time with forensic support. Their recollection was consistent. Painfully so. Emotion rose not because of fear, but because of relief. For years, they had carried a fragment of truth that didn't fit anywhere. Now it had a place. Now it mattered. As momentum built, law enforcement faced a difficult decision. When to move. Too early, and the case could fracture. Too late, and the suspect could disappear, physically or psychologically. Time, once again, became a weapon. But this time, it cut both ways. The suspect made a small mistake. A casual comment to an acquaintance. A detail shared without caution. It contradicted a statement made to investigators weeks earlier. Word traveled quietly. Investigators noted it without reaction. People reveal more when they believe the moment has passed. The file grew heavier. The evidence no longer whispered. It spoke plainly, if not yet publicly. The question shifted from what happened to whether the system was ready to confront it. Outside, the town remained unaware. Children rode bikes past places that had once been searched with flashlights. Neighbors waved to one another, unaware that one of their own was standing at the edge of exposure. Normalcy persisted, fragile and temporary. And beneath it all, the case waited, no longer patient, no longer silent, but poised. The next move would change everything. The sixth movement of the case unfolded without spectacle, without sirens, without headlines. It unfolded in conference rooms with stale coffee and low voices, in late-night offices lit by desk lamps, in the quiet recalibration of people who realized they were no longer chasing a mystery, but escorting it toward confession. Momentum did not feel triumphant. It felt heavy. Investigators began preparing the ground beneath the suspect without letting them feel the tremor. Surveillance was subtle, legal, intermittent, just enough to observe patterns. Just enough to see where pressure might cause cracks. The suspect's routine was ordinary, almost aggressively so. Work. Home. Social obligations performed with mechanical precision. Normalcy as camouflage. But normal routines don't survive scrutiny forever. Digital forensics reached backward in time, resurrecting fragments the suspect assumed were lost. Old phone records. Not conversations, metadata. Durations. Towers. Gaps where activity should have been. Silence, in this case, was louder than speech. It didn't align with the story told. It aligned with avoidance. The unexpected witness remained a quiet anchor. Investigators checked in regularly, not for new information, but to ensure stability. The witness's life had changed simply by telling the truth. Sleep fractured. Anxiety surged. Memory replayed itself uninvited. The past doesn't stay contained once you open it. In parallel, investigators ran behavioral analysis, not to profile a killer, but to map decision-making. What kind of person waits? What kind of person doesn't panic? What kind of person returns to a routine after something irreversible? The patterns suggested control, not rage. Calculation. Someone who believed they could outlast consequences. That belief had been rewarded for decades. A second interview was scheduled with the suspect. This time, the strategy shifted. No confrontation. No accusation. The goal was to let them talk. People who have lied for years often reveal truth through excess, not omission. They fill silence with explanation. They defend things that aren't under attack. The suspect arrived guarded but cooperative. They answered questions smoothly at first, repeating familiar phrases, leaning on the comfort of repetition. Then investigators asked about a minor logistical detail, something innocuous, something that should have been forgettable. The suspect overexplained, corrected themselves mid-sentence, laughed. The room went quiet. Investigators didn't react. They let the moment breathe. Afterward, Analysts replayed the recording frame by frame. Microexpressions, vocal shifts, stress markers. None of it proved guilt. But together, it painted a picture of someone exerting effort. Truth doesn't require that much maintenance. The case file was now thick enough to intimidate. Chronologies overlapped. Witness statements cross-referenced. Forensic data layered like sediment. What once felt speculative now felt inevitable. The only missing element was timing. Prosecutors requested a mock trial. A rehearsal not for performance, but for failure. They invited colleagues to tear the case apart, to find weaknesses before defense attorneys could. Arguments flew. Doubts surfaced. Some evidence held. Some didn't. The weakest pieces were removed without regret. Better to lose them now than in front of a jury. The strongest element remained the convergence. Independent witnesses. Independent data. Independent records. All pointing inward. All narrowing the field until only one explanation remained. The suspect felt it now. Friends stopped calling. Invitations dried up. Conversations felt strained. Even without knowing specifics, they sensed judgment forming. Suspicion has weight. It alters how people look at you, how long they pause before responding, how silence stretches after you speak. At night, the suspect slept poorly. Dreams collapsed chronology. The past intruded without warning. Not guilt, fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of being seen clearly for the first time. Investigators noticed changes. Subtle shifts in behavior. A shorter temper. Increased isolation. Signals that pressure was doing its work. Still, they waited. Because the most dangerous moment in any long-buried case is the moment before truth becomes public. That is when people run. Or confess. Or break. And somewhere in that narrowing window, the case leaned forward, balanced on the edge of action, waiting for the final push that would send it crashing into the open. By the seventh turn of the story, silence itself had become an active force. It pressed into conversations, stretched between questions, lingered in rooms after people left. This was no longer the quiet of uncertainty. It was the quiet of something about to be said aloud, something that had waited decades for the right conditions to surface. Investigators felt it first. A collective tension settled in, not frantic, not panicked, but alert. Like hunters who know the animal is close, not because they can see it, but because the forest has gone still. No birds. No wind. Just anticipation. The suspect's behavior continued to shift. Not dramatically. Nothing that would justify immediate action, but enough to confirm that pressure was being felt. They canceled a routine appointment without explanation. They avoided a social gathering they had never missed before. Small withdrawals from public life. Subtle retreats from visibility. People who believe they are about to be seen often try to disappear in plain sight. Law enforcement escalated quietly. A background financial review revealed nothing illegal, but it did reveal anxiety. Withdrawals. Reorganizations. A will updated unexpectedly. These were not admissions. They were preparations. Meanwhile, the unexpected witness received a call they had both hoped for and feared. Investigators wanted to go on record. Officially.
Permanently.
The statement would no longer live in the protected space of investigation. It would enter the legal bloodstream of the case. The witness hesitated, then agreed. Some truths demand witnesses willing to stand behind them. The interview was meticulous. Every word measured. Every pause documented. The witness did not embellish. They didn't need to. Their memory had not grown more dramatic with time. It had grown more precise.
Trauma does that.
It strips away excess until only the core remains. At the same time, forensic specialists returned to physical evidence once dismissed as inconclusive. Advances in trace analysis allowed them to extract data that simply hadn't been possible before. Not a smoking gun. Not yet. But fragments. Fibers. Residue patterns. The kind of details that don't accuse, but corroborate. The pieces were aligning with unnerving elegance. Investigators debated the arrest. Not whether it would happen, but how.
When.
The suspect had not fled. That argued for patience. But waiting carried its own risks. A single leak. A single rumor. A single moment of panic. The balance between caution and decisiveness narrowed. Then came the phone call. It was unplanned, unprompted. A former acquaintance of the suspect reached out, unsure why now, unsure what had triggered the memory. They described a conversation from years ago, a remark that had seemed strange even then. Something said casually, almost jokingly, about being lucky no one ever looked too hard. At the time, it had been meaningless. Now it landed with force. Investigators didn't rush to elevate it. They verified. They cross-checked timelines. They compared phrasing. The remark aligned disturbingly well with known facts that had never been public. Knowledge the suspect should not have had unless they were closer to the truth than they claimed. This was the moment when theory hardened into direction. Prosecutors were briefed again. This time, the room felt different. Less debate. More focus. The case no longer asked if it could move forward. It asked how cleanly it could do so. The suspect sensed the shift even without knowing its source. Their demeanor changed. Less cooperative. More guarded. Questions were answered, but with irritation. Trust had evaporated. They were no longer participating. They were enduring. Investigators decided to apply controlled pressure. Not an arrest. Not yet. But a notification. A formal letter requesting further cooperation. Legal language. Explicit timelines. No threats. Just clarity. The letter arrived on a quiet afternoon. Neighbors would later say nothing seemed unusual. The suspect checked the mail, walked inside, closed the door. But inside, something fractured. The illusion of indefinite delay collapsed. The future narrowed into a sequence of unavoidable events. That night, the suspect made another mistake. They contacted someone they shouldn't have, spoke too freely, asked a question that revealed fear rather than curiosity. The call was not recorded, but it was remembered. Memory once again became evidence. Investigators knew the window was closing. The case had reached that volatile stage where movement in any direction could cause irreversible consequences. They coordinated. Warrants were prepared, but not yet signed. Teams were briefed, but not deployed. Everyone waited for the final confirmation, the piece that would make hesitation irresponsible. It arrived just before dawn. A forensic report. Clean. Technical. Undeniable. It didn't scream guilt. It didn't dramatize. It simply stated that a previously overlooked sample, when processed with modern methods, could no longer be considered unrelated. Probability collapsed. Coincidence evaporated. The room went silent as the conclusion was read. This was it. The decision was made, without ceremony. The arrest would happen.
Carefully.
Publicly enough to ensure accountability. Quietly enough to avoid spectacle. The goal was justice, not theater. Outside, the town woke up as it always did. Coffee brewed. Cars started. People moved through routines unaware that one of their longest shadows was about to detach itself from the ground. And somewhere behind a closed door, a life constructed on the assumption of permanent secrecy stood on the brink of exposure, seconds away from becoming history, evidence, and headline all at once. Morning broke without ceremony, the kind of morning that pretends nothing is about to change. Pale light crept across parking lots and storefront windows, touched the courthouse steps, slid along the edges of a town that had learned to live with an unanswered question. Somewhere between sunrise and routine, the machinery of the state began to move. Unmarked vehicles rolled out one by one, spaced deliberately, never in a convoy. Radios stayed quiet. No sirens. No flashing lights. This was not a chase. This was a collection. Years of waiting had distilled into a single objective: arrive, contain, conclude. Inside the command room, the atmosphere was stripped of emotion. Names were replaced with roles. Addresses with coordinates. Every possible variable was rehearsed aloud, then discarded. They were past speculation now. This was execution in the procedural sense. Precise, disciplined, irreversible. The suspect woke up early that day. Neighbors would later say the lights were already on before dawn, that movement could be seen through the curtains. Restlessness has a way of announcing itself. Coffee sat untouched on the counter. A phone was checked, then checked again. No messages. No missed calls. Silence, heavy and accusatory. At exactly the moment planned, the knock came. Not loud, not aggressive, just firm enough to remove doubt. A sound that doesn't ask, only informs. When the door opened, the world narrowed. Identification was shown. Words were spoken carefully, deliberately, as if volume alone could shatter decades of denial. You are being detained. Time fractured. For a split second, the suspect looked confused, not shocked, not angry, but disoriented. As if the future they had rehearsed for so long had suddenly failed to load. Hands trembled. Breathing shortened. Questions surfaced, but none that mattered. Outside, the arrest unfolded with clinical calm. No resistance. No scene. The kind of moment that would never make it into dramatic reenactments, precisely because it was so quiet. The absence of spectacle was the spectacle. A neighbor's dog barked. Someone across the street paused mid-step. A curtain shifted. The town began to notice. News traveled faster than the vehicles. A single text, then another. A name whispered. A rumor hardened into fact before the patrol cars had even left the block. By the time the suspect was seated in the back, eyes forward, wrists restrained, the community was already rewriting its memory of them. At the station, the process resumed its relentless rhythm. Photographs, fingerprints, documentation. Each action stripped away another layer of anonymity, replacing it with record, timestamp, chain of custody. The suspect said little. When they did speak, it was fragmented, defensive, disconnected. Investigators watched closely. This was not the behavior of someone surprised by an accusation. This was the posture of someone confronting confirmation. The unexpected witness was notified shortly after. They sat with the phone in both hands, listening to the words they had imagined but never fully believed would arrive.
An arrest.
Real. Not symbolic. Not provisional.
Real.
The weight of it settled slowly, unevenly, like snow on fragile ground. Across town, reporters scrambled. Headlines were drafted before details were confirmed. Phrases like cold case and breakthrough surged back into circulation. But underneath the urgency, there was hesitation. No one wanted to say too much. Not yet. The story had waited this long. It could wait a few more hours. Inside the interrogation room, the air was different. Not hostile. Focused. The suspect was offered water. Declined. Offered again. Accepted. Small gestures. Human ones. The kind that makes silence louder. Questions began broadly. Background. Timeline. Memories revisited. Answers came easily at first, rehearsed over years. But then the rhythm shifted. Investigators introduced details not previously discussed. Facts never released. Observations drawn from the witness statement, from the forensic report, from the overlooked fragments now sharpened by technology. The suspect faltered. Not dramatically. Just enough. A pause stretched too long. An answer arrived a beat late. Language tightened. Shoulders lifted. Defensive posture crept in uninvited. They were shown a document. Not everything. Just enough to signal depth. To suggest that the ground beneath their story had eroded beyond repair. The suspect stared at it, lips pressed thin. The room filled with the sound of breathing and paper. Outside the room, investigators watched through glass. This was not about extracting a confession.
Not yet.
This was about observation. About watching the moment when belief collapses internally, even if denial remains external. The town absorbed the news unevenly. Some reacted with disbelief, others with grim satisfaction, a few with grief renewed, sharpened by proximity to resolution. Memorials resurfaced. Old photographs circulated again. Faces frozen in time returned to screens and pages. By evening, the story had a name, a face, a narrative arc. But the truth was still in fragments. The arrest was not an ending. It was a rupture, a tearing open of sealed memory. The suspect was transferred to holding, isolated, the weight of the day pressing down without distraction. No phone, no audience,
Just walls and time. For the first time in decades, there was no exit strategy, only process. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath of the arrest, the town felt it, the shift. The sense that something long buried had finally broken the surface, dragging consequences into the light. Justice had not yet spoken, but it had stood up. The night settled in, heavy and electric, carrying with it the knowledge that by morning, nothing, no memory, no reputation, no silence, would ever be the same again. Night didn't bring rest. It brought reckoning. The kind that creeps in through cracks, settles into corners, and refuses to be ignored. In the holding facility, fluorescent lights hummed without mercy, bleaching time into something shapeless. Minutes stretched. Hours folded in on themselves. The suspect lay awake, staring at a ceiling they had never imagined would become permanent, replaying choices that once felt invisible. Across town, sleep came in fragments. People woke to check their phones, scrolling through updates that said everything and nothing at once. An arrest. A name.
No details. The gaps invited speculation, and speculation filled the dark like smoke. Every memory became suspect. Every past interaction replayed under a harsher lens. At the station, the case files were reopened not ceremonially, but urgently. Boxes long sealed were unstacked, contents spread across tables like pieces of a map that had finally revealed its scale. Photographs yellowed with age sat beside fresh printouts. Old handwriting clashed with modern fonts. Decades collapsed into a single workspace. Investigators moved with quiet intensity. This was the moment they had prepared for, but never fully expected to reach. The unexpected witness's testimony had cracked the surface. Now the fracture widened. Every statement, every recorded interview, every overlooked detail was re-examined, not to confirm guilt, but to ensure precision. Nothing could be assumed.
Not now.
The witness returned to their routine, or tried to. The world felt louder. Glances lingered longer. Conversations stopped when they entered a room. They had stepped forward, and the cost of that courage became immediately visible. But beneath the anxiety, there was something else. Relief. Fragile. Unsteady.
Real.
Morning news broadcasts adopted a different tone. Not celebratory. Cautious. Anchors spoke slowly, choosing words that acknowledged gravity without promising closure. Developing story. Ongoing investigation. Community impact. Phrases designed to hold space for truth still forming. At the courthouse, preparations began quietly. No cameras yet. No crowds. Just clerks pulling calendars, administrators coordinating security, the system aligning itself around a case that had outlived expectations. This was no longer a memory. It was an active wound. The suspect was brought in for a second round of questioning. This time, the approach shifted. Less narrative. More confrontation. Investigators laid out inconsistencies, not as accusations, but as facts that refused to reconcile. Dates that didn't align. Movements unsupported by records. Absences that grew louder with repetition. The suspect responded with deflection. Then frustration. Then silence. The arc was familiar. But what wasn't familiar was the absence of confidence. The certainty that had once armored their story was gone, replaced by calculation and fatigue. At one point, a question landed with unexpected force. Simple. Specific. Anchored in a detail only someone present would know. The suspect blinked, swallowed, looked away. The room held its breath. They didn't answer. That refusal said more than any confession could have. Outside, the community gathered fragments of truth from whatever sources they could find. Social media filled the gaps with conjecture. Old rumors resurfaced, sharpened by hindsight. People remembered moments that now felt charged, behaviors once dismissed as quirks that suddenly carried weight. Families connected to the case felt the resurgence most acutely. Grief, long dormant, surged back with violent clarity. The arrest had reopened doors they had learned to keep shut. Hope and pain arrived together, inseparable. By afternoon, the prosecutor's office issued a statement. Careful, measured, acknowledging progress without declaring victory. The words were designed to withstand scrutiny, to avoid contaminating what would come next. This was no longer about headlines. It was about endurance. In the holding cell, the suspect requested a phone call, then canceled it, asked for water, didn't drink it. The rhythm of indecision took hold. Every option carried consequence now. Every silence was noted. As the day waned, investigators compiled their findings, preparing for what lay ahead. Warrants, motions, hearings. The machinery of justice didn't rush, but it didn't hesitate either. Momentum had shifted, and there was no reversing it. When night fell again, it brought with it a different atmosphere. Less electric, more deliberate. The kind of calm that follows impact when shock gives way to assessment. The town knew something fundamental had changed, even if the outcome remained uncertain. The case was no longer frozen in time. It was moving, slowly, relentlessly. And with each step forward, the shadows that had protected the truth for so long began to recede, leaving behind outlines that could no longer be ignored. The next morning arrived without ceremony, but the air felt heavier, as if the town itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Doors opened. Cars started. Radios murmured low, every broadcast circling the same words without daring to sharpen them. Cold case. Arrest. Witness. Nothing else needed to be said. Everyone already felt it pressing against their ribs. Inside the courthouse, the machinery of procedure turned slowly, deliberately, with no regard for the decades of waiting that had led here. Files were logged. Evidence was cataloged again, this time with hands that knew every movement might be dissected in a courtroom months from now. Chain of custody, verification, redundancy, precision became obsession. The suspect was transported under muted security, no sirens, no spectacle. Just the quiet efficiency reserved for moments when the system understands the weight of its own actions. Shackles echoed softly against the floor, a sound that lingered longer than expected, bouncing down hallways that had heard countless footsteps, but never quite like this. In the interrogation room, the tone shifted again. Not aggressive, not sympathetic, controlled. Investigators spoke less, listened more. Silence became a tool, stretched thin until it hummed. The suspect's breathing filled the space, uneven now, no longer synchronized with rehearsed responses. A photograph was placed on the table. Not dramatic, not graphic, just ordinary enough to be devastating. A place, a time, a detail that aligned too cleanly with the witness's account to dismiss. The suspect stared at it, eyes tracing edges, searching for an escape route that wasn't there. Outside those walls, the unexpected witness faced their own reckoning. Messages arrived from unknown numbers, some supportive, some hostile. Fear arrived late, after the adrenaline had faded. They replayed their statement again and again, wondering if every word had been enough or too much. The truth, once released, didn't return quietly. Reporters gathered at a distance, respecting boundaries while straining against them. Cameras rolled on empty sidewalks, on courthouse steps with no one yet emerging. The absence of imagery became its own story. Something was happening behind closed doors, and the waiting magnified it. Back in the evidence room, a discovery shifted the temperature. A minor item, long dismissed, now reframed by the witness's timeline. It didn't scream relevance. It whispered it. Investigators leaned in, cross-referencing logs, pulling archived reports that hadn't seen daylight in years. Patterns began to surface, faint but undeniable. The suspect was asked about that item. Their response came too quickly, too rehearsed, a reflex from another time. One investigator made a note. Another didn't look up at all. They had learned long ago that moments like this were fragile, easily disturbed by reaction. By afternoon, the defense attorney arrived. Calm, polished, eyes sharp with calculation. They asked for time, requested limits, reminded everyone that an arrest was not a verdict. The system acknowledged the reminder without flinching. Everyone in the room understood the same thing. This was just beginning. Across town, families tied to the case gathered quietly. No cameras, no statements,
Just shared space and shared history. Some spoke. Some didn't. The name of the suspect hung between them, heavy and unresolved. Relief battled disbelief. Justice felt close, but still out of reach. As evening approached, the prosecutor reviewed the case again, line by line, searching not for confirmation but for weakness. This was the moment when confidence could become liability. Every assumption was challenged. Every narrative tested against the cold, indifferent standards of law. The suspect was returned to the holding cell as daylight faded. They sat differently now. Shoulders rounded, eyes unfocused. The armor was cracking, not from pressure, but from inevitability. The future they had avoided imagining was taking shape, minute by minute. Night fell with a quieter weight than before. The town didn't buzz this time. It waited. Phones stayed face down. Conversations trailed off. Somewhere between hope and dread, the community held its breath again, knowing that the truth was closer than it had ever been, and that when it finally surfaced, it would change everything it touched. Morning returned like an interrogation light, too bright, too sudden, exposing everything people had tried to keep in shadow overnight. The courthouse doors opened again, and with them came a low, restless murmur that never quite rose to a crowd but never disappeared either. Shoes scraped concrete. Coffee cups shook slightly in unsteady hands. No one spoke loudly. This was no longer curiosity. This was consequence. Inside, the case moved forward in increments so small they felt almost cruel. Motions filed. Objections anticipated. Timelines reconstructed down to the minute. Investigators rewalked their steps from the night before, replaying every question, every pause, every flicker of expression they had cataloged without reacting. In cases like this, emotion was a contaminant. Precision was survival. The unexpected witness arrived under a different kind of scrutiny now. Not suspicion, but gravity. Their presence altered the room before they even spoke. A living hinge between past and present. Their account, once just a memory, had become a structural beam holding the case upright. Any crack would matter. Any inconsistency would be exploited. They were reminded to breathe, to slow down, to speak only what they knew, not what they felt. Memory is a dangerous thing when sharpened by time. The witness nodded, hands folded tightly, knuckles pale, as if holding on to the truth required physical effort. In another room, the suspect's legal team began assembling a counter-narrative. Not denial, redirection. Alternative explanations stacked carefully, each one plausible enough to plant doubt. Time erodes certainty. Memories shift. Evidence degrades. They leaned into those truths with professional calm. This was not about innocence. It was about uncertainty. The investigators anticipated this. They always did. That was why the files were thick, why redundancies existed, why nothing relied on a single voice, no matter how compelling. The witness had opened the door, but what lay beyond it had to stand on its own. A timeline was projected onto a wall. The hours of that long-ago night stretched thin and dissected. Every known movement, every recorded call, every gap circled in red. One of those gaps had always been a problem. Too wide, too quiet. Now it pulsed with possibility. The suspect was questioned again, this time with that gap in mind. The questions were simple, almost casual. Where were you between these times? Who can confirm it? The answers came slower now. Hesitation crept in, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of hesitation that didn't exist before. Outside, the town's patience wore thin. Speculation seeped into grocery store aisles and gas station lines. Old rumors resurfaced, reshaped by new context. People replayed conversations from decades ago, wondering what they had missed, who they had believed too easily, who they had dismissed without cause. The victim's name appeared again in print, carefully, respectfully, but its impact was no less sharp. For some, it reopened wounds they had learned to live with. For others, it triggered guilt they had never acknowledged. Cold cases don't stay cold because people forget. They stay cold because remembering hurts. By midday, a decision loomed. Charge now or wait. Move forward or tighten the net further. Prosecutors weighed risk against momentum. Delay could strengthen the case or fracture it. Move too fast, and defense would pounce on any weakness left unaddressed. The unexpected witness sat alone during the wait, staring at nothing, hearing everything. The sound of distant doors closing, the hum of fluorescent lights, the echo of their own voice repeating statements they had rehearsed for years without ever knowing if they would matter. Now they did. And that knowledge was heavier than fear. When the call came, it was brief, direct. The case would proceed. The charge would be filed. The line had been crossed, and there was no quiet way back. In the holding cell, the suspect received the news without theatrics. No outburst. No collapse. Just a long exhale, as if some internal countdown had reached zero. For decades, they had lived with the possibility of this moment, even if they never admitted it. Now it was no longer hypothetical. Paperwork moved quickly after that. Signatures. Dates. A future defined by court appearances instead of routines. The system didn't celebrate. It rarely does. It simply advanced one measured step at a time. As night fell again, the town absorbed the shift. Something irreversible had happened. Not closure. Not yet. But direction. After years of standing still, the case was moving, and everyone could feel the ground trembling beneath it, uncertain whether the truth would finally surface cleanly or tear everything apart on its way up. The first full night after the charge passed without sleep for almost anyone who mattered to the case. Lights burned in kitchens long past midnight. Televisions stayed muted but glowing, as if silence itself might crack under the weight of the news. The town did not erupt. It held its breath. That was more unsettling. This was no longer rumor. No longer speculation. This was a name, a charge, a date on the calendar, and the realization that the past had finally reached forward and grabbed the present by the throat. Inside the jail, the suspect lay awake, staring at a ceiling they had never imagined belonging to them. Every sound was amplified. Footsteps in the corridor. Keys shifting on a belt. The mechanical certainty of doors opening and closing, each one sealing a little more of the life they once knew. Regret did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, flashes of moments they thought had vanished forever. A face, a place, a decision made in seconds that now stretched across decades. At the prosecutor's office, preparation intensified with a ruthless clarity. There was no room left for theory. Everything had to be concrete. Every claim backed. Every assumption interrogated. The unexpected witness had transformed the case, but transformation invited scrutiny. Defense would not attack loudly. They would dissect quietly, looking for fractures invisible to the untrained eye. Investigators returned to evidence storage before dawn, pulling boxes that had not been opened in years. Labels yellowed. Tape brittle. Inside, the artifacts of a life interrupted, personal items catalogued with clinical detachment, never meant to carry this much weight. They handled them carefully now, as if time itself might object to being disturbed. The witness was interviewed again, then again, each retelling tested against the others. Not to trap them, to protect them. Consistency was armor. Any deviation, no matter how human, would be weaponized. Memory was a battlefield, and the witness knew it. Their voice wavered once, then steadied. They had carried this long enough. If it hurt now, so be it. Outside, the town began choosing sides without saying so out loud. Some defended the accused with a reflexive loyalty born of familiarity. Others recoiled, replaying years of polite encounters with a new sense of unease. The most painful reactions came from those who realized they had once brushed past the truth and kept walking. Media interest intensified, but carefully. No circus. Just pointed questions and steady lenses. Cold case. Breakthrough. Arrest. Each word precise, stripped of flourish, because flourish would cheapen what this had become. For the victim's family, every headline was a double-edged blade. Validation wrapped in exposure. Justice moving forward, but grief dragged back into the light. The courtroom sat empty during these early days, a quiet vessel waiting to be filled with consequence. Benches polished. Flags unmoving. It looked indifferent, but it wasn't. It had seen this before. Lives laid out, piece by piece, until truth either emerged or collapsed under its own contradictions. Defense attorneys worked late into the night, mapping alternate timelines, hunting for doubt like prospectors panning muddy water. The witnesses' proximity, their delay in coming forward, the reliability of memory after so long. They didn't need to disprove the story, only complicate it, only make jurors hesitate. Prosecutors anticipated every move, refining questions until they were sharp enough to cut through confusion without drawing blood. This was not about theatrics. This was about momentum, about keeping the narrative anchored to facts so solid they could not be shaken loose. In quiet moments, investigators allowed themselves to feel something close to awe, not triumph, awe, at the way a single human voice, long silent, had reoriented an entire investigation, at how close the truth had been all along, waiting for the right moment to surface. By the end of the week, the case had changed the town's rhythm. Conversations paused when certain names surfaced. Familiar streets felt different, charged with unspoken history. The past was no longer distant. It walked beside people now, reminding them that time does not erase. It only delays. And as the first court date approached, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just about what happened decades ago. It was about what would happen next, about whether the system, once stalled, could now move with purpose, about whether the truth, once exposed, would withstand the light long enough to be believed. The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived without ceremony, gray and unannounced, the kind of day that seemed to erase itself even as it unfolded. Yet nothing about it was ordinary. Cars lined the streets around the courthouse earlier than usual. People who had no legal reason to be there still came, lingering near the steps, pretending to check phones, pretending not to watch the doors. The building did not loom. It waited. Inside, the air felt compressed. Every movement echoed too loudly. Papers whispered. Shoes scuffed. The accused was brought in through a side entrance, hands cuffed, posture rigid, face carefully neutral. Years of living unchallenged had not prepared them for this walk. This was not gossip. This was gravity. The victim's family entered separately, quieter, carrying a different weight. They had imagined this moment in fragments for years, never sure it would arrive, never sure they wanted it to. Closure was a word people used too easily. There was nothing closed about this. It was a reopening, a tearing back of scar tissue to expose what had never truly healed. The unexpected witness sat near the front, shoulders squared, eyes forward. They had rehearsed their breathing, practiced grounding themselves in the present. Still, the room felt unreal, like a stage set constructed for someone else's tragedy. When they glanced back and saw the accused for the first time in decades, the moment stretched, thin and fragile. Recognition flickered. Something unreadable passed between them. Then the gaze broke. That was enough. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Everyone sat. The machinery of justice began turning again, gears grinding against years of rust. Names were read into the record. Charges stated plainly, without emotion. Dates, locations, statutes. The language was cold by design. It had to be. Emotion would come later. The prosecution spoke first, outlining the case with restraint. No embellishment. No rhetoric. Just a path, carefully drawn, from the night of the crime to the present moment. The witness was mentioned, not dramatized. Evidence was referenced, not paraded. The message was subtle but clear. This case did not need spectacle. It stood on its own. The defense followed, measured and skeptical, questioning the reliability of memory, the danger of hindsight, the injustice of judging the past with modern certainty. They spoke of gaps, of lost evidence, of the impossibility of recreating a moment so far removed from now. Their tone was calm, almost sympathetic, as if acknowledging tragedy while resisting blame. Then the witness was called. The room shifted. This was the hinge on which everything turned. The oath was administered. The chair scraped softly as they sat. For a moment no one spoke. Silence pressed in, thick and expectant.
The witness began slowly, voice steady but quiet, recounting where they were, what they saw, what they heard. They did not rush. They did not embellish. They described the night as it had lived inside them for decades, unchanged in its essential shape. A figure, a sound, a moment of wrongness that lodged in the body before the mind could name it. As they spoke, the courtroom seemed to contract around their words. Details emerged not as revelations, but as confirmations, aligning with evidence that had waited patiently for this context. The timeline snapped into place. The geography made sense. The contradictions that once muddied the case began to drain away. The defense cross-examined with precision, testing every edge. Why wait so long? Why speak now? How could they be sure? The witness answered without defensiveness. Fear, youth, pressure, the passage of time, and finally, the truth that mattered most. The memory had never left. It had only been buried under years of trying to live normally. When it was over, the witness stepped down, legs trembling, breath shallow. They did not look back. They didn't need to. Something irreversible had already occurred. The accused remained still, eyes fixed ahead. No outburst. No visible reaction. But the stillness itself was telling. The kind that comes from calculation, from walls built carefully over a lifetime, now under assault. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited, but questions were restrained. Everyone sensed the delicacy of the moment. This was not a verdict. This was a threshold. By afternoon, the judge ruled there was sufficient cause to proceed. The words landed quietly, but their impact rippled outward. The case would go to trial. The past would be examined in full view. There would be no turning back. As people filtered out, the town absorbed the news in fragments. Text messages, short calls, headlines that avoided adjectives. The reality settled unevenly. For some, relief. For others, disbelief. For a few, dread. That night, the accused was returned to their cell. The walls closer now, the future narrower. The calculations resumed. Plea deals considered. Stories adjusted. Silence weighed against confession. The witness went home and sat in the dark, letting the adrenaline fade. The fear was still there, but so was something else. Lightness. Not peace. Not yet, but movement after years of standing still. Investigators reviewed transcripts late into the night, marking passages, noting reactions, already planning the next phase. They knew the road ahead would be brutal. Trials were not about truth alone. They were about persuasion, about endurance, about surviving scrutiny without losing coherence. And beneath it all, the victim remained present, not as an abstract name, but as a constant absence shaping every decision. The case had advanced, yes, but justice was not yet served. It was only closer than it had ever been. The days between the hearing and the trial date did not feel like waiting. They felt like pressure. Every hour added weight. Every night peeled back defenses people thought were permanent. The town moved, but differently now, as if each street carried a second, invisible map, one drawn by memory, rumor, and fear. At the center of it all, the courthouse stood unchanged, brick and stone indifferent to the lives orbiting it. Inside, files multiplied. Evidence was pulled from storage, unpacked, relabeled, scanned under lights far brighter than the ones it had first known. Old photographs were enlarged until the grain looked like snowstorms frozen in time. Audio tapes hissed as they spun again, voices long muted re-entering the air, uncertain, fragile, suddenly relevant. Investigators approached the case with a new intensity, one sharpened by proximity. This was no longer a theoretical reconstruction. This was a narrative that would soon be attacked from every angle. Every assumption had to be stripped down. Every conclusion tested, as if it were hostile. They rewalked the route. They retimed the distance. They stood in the same places at the same hours, listening to the same ambient sounds, trying to hear what had once been missed. The unexpected witness was brought back in, not once, but several times. Each interview was careful, controlled, respectful. The goal was not to extract something new, but to ensure consistency, to fortify memory against the assault that was coming. Defense strategies were anticipated, rehearsed. Human memory, they knew, would be framed as unreliable, emotional, self-serving. The witness understood this and still returned, each time with the same quiet resolve. They were no longer alone with the memory. That changed everything. The accused met with counsel behind closed doors, conversations held low and clipped. Options were laid out with legal precision. A plea might reduce exposure. Silence might preserve leverage. Cooperation might redirect blame. Each path carried risk, and none offered escape. The past had arrived intact, unimpressed by strategy. At night, the accused lay awake, replaying moments once dismissed as inconsequential. A glance held too long. A decision made too quickly. A lie told, so often it had begun to sound like truth. Now, those fragments assembled themselves into a pattern that could not be denied. The fear was not of punishment alone. It was of recognition, of being seen clearly, without the benefit of doubt or distraction. The victim's family prepared in their own way. They gathered documents they had never thrown away. Letters, photos, handwritten notes that captured ordinary moments now rendered extraordinary by loss. They spoke quietly among themselves, negotiating how much of their grief would be made public, how much would remain sacred. They knew the trial would not belong to them. It would belong to the record. Still, their presence mattered. It always had. Community members took sides without meaning to. Some clung to the comfort of familiarity, insisting the accused was not capable of such a thing. Others felt vindicated, their old suspicions now validated by official action. Conversations grew tense. Long-standing friendships cooled. The case had reopened fault lines that had never truly closed, only settled beneath the surface. Media coverage intensified, but cautiously. Language was chosen with care. Words like alleged and accused did heavy lifting, trying to balance public interest with legal reality. Still, the story took on momentum. It was shared, dissected, argued over in comment sections and late-night calls. The town's name began to circulate beyond its borders, attached once again to a crime it had tried to forget. Behind the scenes, forensic experts revisited physical evidence with modern tools. What once yielded nothing now spoke in probabilities and partial matches. Technology had advanced quietly, relentlessly, waiting for the right moment. Patterns emerged that had been invisible before. Not definitive alone, but persuasive in combination. The case was no longer built on a single pillar. It was an architecture of corroboration. As the trial date approached, the courtroom was transformed. Technology was installed. Screens mounted. Seating adjusted. The space prepared itself for a performance that was anything but theatrical. This would be methodical.
Exhausting. Slow.
Truth here would not arrive with a flourish. It would emerge inch by inch under oath. The witness received threats, anonymous, cowardly, predictable. Law enforcement responded swiftly, visibly. Protection was offered, routes adjusted, routines altered. Fear flared, but did not take hold. The witness had already crossed the most difficult threshold. Everything after that was consequence. On the eve of the trial, the town went quiet. Not silent, but subdued. Even the usual noises seemed dampened, as if the air itself were bracing. People stayed in. Lights went off earlier. Somewhere, a radio murmured news that no longer felt distant. The accused was escorted to holding, separated now from the illusion of normalcy. The weight of the charges pressed in, unignorable. In a moment of unguarded honesty, they asked their attorney a simple question, one that carried no legal strategy. How does this usually end? The answer was not reassuring. It was truthful. Across town, the witness sat alone, staring at a wall where shadows shifted with passing headlights. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams replayed the night not as it was, but as it might have been if one choice had gone differently. The body remembered even when the mind tried to rest. Morning arrived, without ceremony. No music, no announcement. Just light through blinds, traffic resuming, the world insisting on continuity. But this day would mark a division, before and after. As doors opened and people took their places, the sense of inevitability settled in. This was not about winning. It was about exposure, about allowing the past to speak in full sentences at last. The judge entered. The room rose. The room sat. The trial began. And with it, the final unraveling of a story that had waited decades for this exact moment, poised between truth and denial, ready to demand its due. The first witness took the stand under fluorescent lights that revealed everything and forgave nothing. Voices were steady until they weren't. Timelines were introduced not as stories but as facts, clipped and exacting, each minute accounted for, each gap exposed like a wound that never healed cleanly. The prosecution moved with restraint, knowing the power was not in spectacle but in accumulation. One detail, then another, then another. The room began to feel smaller as the narrative tightened its grip. The unexpected witness entered without drama, no hesitation in their step, no flourish in their posture. Just a human being carrying the weight of years into a chair that had been empty for too long. When they spoke, the courtroom leaned forward. Not because the voice was loud, but because it was certain. Memory here was not theatrical. It was precise. Locations named. Sounds described. A moment isolated and held up to the light until its edges were unmistakable. The defense pressed hard, as expected. Questions came fast, designed to confuse, to fracture, to suggest influence and contamination. Time passed. The witness did not bend. Each answer landed where it always had. The truth, once buried, now sat upright, unmovable. Jurors took notes, pens scratching like rain against glass. Evidence followed. Forensics layered over testimony, not to replace it, but to reinforce it. Old samples, newly interpreted. Probability charts that spoke in numbers instead of certainty, yet still pointed in only one direction. The past, once fuzzy and incomplete, had sharpened with age. Then came the moment no one could prepare for. A piece of evidence overlooked for decades, not because it was invisible, but because no one had known how to read it. A hidden clue, mundane in appearance, devastating in implication. When it was explained, slowly, methodically, a murmur moved through the room. Not disbelief. Recognition. The sound of something clicking into place all at once. The accused watched from the defense table, expression carefully managed, but eyes betraying the effort. This was the fracture point. The place where the story they had relied on for survival began to collapse inward. Each revelation stripped away another layer of plausible distance. By the time the prosecution rested, the silence was heavy, suffocating. No one rushed to fill it. Closing arguments came and went, words chosen like instruments, each side attempting to frame the same facts into different meanings. But momentum is not easily reversed. It has a sound, a pressure, a direction. The jury was sent away, and the waiting resumed, now sharper, now unbearable. Hours passed, then more. Night fell again. The town held its breath. When the jury returned, they did so without hesitation. No confusion, no compromise. The verdict was read aloud, each word final, irreversible. A collective exhale rippled through the room, followed by something quieter, something deeper. Relief, yes, but also grief. Justice had arrived late, and it carried the cost of time with it. The accused reacted not with anger, not with protest, but with collapse. Shoulders slumped. The long performance ended in a single breath. There would be appeals, motions, paperwork. But the truth had been spoken in a language the law recognized. It would not be taken back. Outside, cameras flashed, microphones extended, questions fired into the night air. Officials spoke carefully. The witness said nothing, slipping away unnoticed, their role complete. The family stood together, hands linked, eyes closed for a moment that belonged only to them. In the days that followed, the town adjusted again. Headlines faded. Conversations shifted. The case, once a shadow, now had edges, a shape, an ending. Not a happy one, not a clean one, but an ending nonetheless. The unexpected witness returned to anonymity, changed forever by the act of stepping forward. They slept differently now. Dreams softened. The body released a tension it had held without permission. Some scars remained. They always would. The victim's name was spoken more often, no longer in whispers, no longer attached only to mystery. A life remembered not for how it ended, but for the fact that it mattered enough for the truth to fight its way back into the light. And somewhere in the quiet that followed, a lesson lingered, unresolved and undeniable. That time does not erase truth. It only waits. That memory, fragile as it seems, can outlast fear. That justice, delayed, is not always justice denied. Sometimes it is justice gathering strength. The case was closed, but its echo remained.